and wrong to retain you in my service. It is a tacit insult to him as my choice and confidential friend to do so, remembering the cause you sided with on the day he was maligned at Westminster. You will leave me to-night. Nay, as soon as we reach home, the sooner the better.' 'If it comes to that, I say so too, my lord. Let Mr Gashford have his will. As to my being a spy, my lord, you know me better than to believe it, I am sure. I don't know much about causes. My cause is the cause of one man against 200, and I hope it always will be.' 'You have said quite enough,' returned Lord George, motioning him to go back. 'I desire to hear no more.' 'If you'll let me have another word, my lord,' returned John Grueby, 'I'll give this silly fellow a caution not to stay here by himself. The proclamation is in a good many hands already, and it's well known that he was concerned in the business it relates to. He had better get to a place of safety if he can, poor creature.' 'You hear what this man says?' cried Lord George, addressing Barnaby, who had looked on and wondered while this dialogue passed. 'He thinks you may be afraid to remain upon your post, and are kept here perhaps against your will. What do you say?' 'I think, young man,' said John in explanation, 'that the soldiers may turn out and take you, and that if they do, you will certainly be hung by the neck till you're dead, dead, dead. And I think you had better go from here as fast as you can. That's what I think.' 'He's a coward, Grip, a coward!' cried Barnaby, putting the raven on the ground and shouldering his staff. 'Let them come. Gordon for ever, let them come.' 'Ay!' said Lord George, 'let them. Let us see who will venture to attack a power like ours, the solemn league of a whole people. Thus, a madman! You have said well, very well. I am proud to be the leader of such men as you.' Barnaby's heart swelled within his bosom as he heard these words. He took Lord George's hand and carried it to his lips, patted his horse's crest, as if the affection and admiration he had conceived for the man extended to the animal he rode, then unfurling his flag and proudly waving it, resumed his pacing up and down. Lord George, with a kindling eye and glowing cheek, took off his hat, and flourishing it above his head, bade him exultingly farewell, then cantered off at a brisk pace, after glancing angrily round to see that his servant followed. Honest John set spurs to his horse and rode after his master, but not before he had again warned Barnaby to retreat, with many significant gestures, which indeed he continued to make, and Barnaby to resist, until the windings of the road concealed them from each other's view. Left to himself again with a still higher sense of the importance of his post, and stimulated to enthusiasm by the special notice and encouragement of his leader, Barnaby walked to and fro in a delicious trance, rather than as a waking man. The sunshine which prevailed around was in his mind. He had but one desire ungratified, if she could only see him now. The day wore on. Its heat was gently giving place to the cool of evening. A light wind sprung up, fanning his long hair, and making the banner rustle pleasantly above his head. There was a freedom and freshness in the sound, and in the time, which chimed exactly with his mood. He was happier than ever. He was leaning on his staff, looking towards the declining sun, and reflecting with a smile that he stood sentinel at that moment over buried gold, when 2 or 3 figures appeared in the distance, making towards the house at a rapid pace, and motioning with their hands as though they urged its inmates to retreat from some approaching danger. As they drew nearer, they became more earnest in their gestures, and they were no sooner within hearing than the foremost among them cried that the soldiers were coming up. At these words, Barnaby furled his flag and tied it round the pole. His heart beat high while he did so, but he had no more fear or thought of retreating than the pole itself. The friendly stragglers hurried past him, after giving him notice of his danger, and quickly passed into the house, where the utmost confusion immediately prevailed. As those within hastily closed the windows and the doors, they urged him by looks and signs to fly without loss of time, and called to him many times to do so. but he only shook his head indignantly in answer, and stood the firmer on his post. Finding that he was not to be persuaded, they took care of themselves, and leaving the place with only one old woman in it, speedily withdrew. As yet there had been no symptom of the news having any better foundation than in the fears of those who brought it, but the Boot had not been deserted 5 minutes, when there appeared, coming across the fields, a body of men who, it was easy to see, by the glitter of their arms and ornaments in the sun, and by their orderly and regular mode of advancing, for they came on as one man, were soldiers. In a very little time, Barnaby knew that they were a strong detachment of the Foot Guards, having along with them 2 gentlemen in private clothes, and a small party of horse. The latter brought up the rear, and were not in number more than 6 or 8. They advanced steadily, neither quickening their pace as they came nearer, nor raising any cry, nor showing the least emotion or anxiety. Though this was a matter of course in the case of regular troops, even to Barnaby there was something particularly impressive and disconcerting in it to one accustomed to the noise and tumult of an undisciplined mob. For all that, he stood his ground not a whit the less resolutely, and looked on undismayed. Presently they marched into the yard and halted. The commanding officer dispatched a messenger to the horsemen, one of whom came riding back. Some words passed between them, and they glanced at Barnaby, who well remembered the man he had unhorsed at Westminster, and saw him now before his eyes. The man, being speedily dismissed, saluted and rode back to his comrades, who were drawn up apart at a short distance. The officer then gave the word to prime and load. The heavy ringing of the musket stocks upon the ground, and the sharp and rapid rattling of the ramrods in their barrels, were a kind of relief to Barnaby, deadly though he knew the purport of such sounds to be. When this was done, other commands were given, and the soldiers instantaneously formed in single file all round the house and stables, completely encircling them in every part, at a distance perhaps of some 6 yards. At least that seemed in Barnaby's eyes to be about the space left between himself and those who confronted him. The horsemen remained drawn up by themselves as before. The 2 gentlemen in private clothes, who had kept aloof, now rode forward, one on either side the officer. The proclamation having been produced, and read by one of them, the officer called on Barnaby to surrender. He made no answer, but stepping within the door, before which he had kept guard, held his pole crosswise to protect it. In the midst of a profound silence, he was again called upon to yield. Still he offered no reply. Indeed, he had enough to do, to run his eye backward and forward along the 6 men who immediately fronted him, and settle hurriedly within himself at which of them he would strike first, when they pressed on him. He caught the eye of one in the centre, and resolved to hew that fellow down, though he died for it. Again there was a dead silence, and again the same voice called upon him to deliver himself up. Next moment he was back in the stable, dealing blows about him like a madman. 2 of the men lay stretched at his feet. The one he had marked dropped first. He had a thought for that, even in the hot blood and hurry of the struggle. Another blow, another. Down, mastered, wounded in the breast by a heavy blow from the butt end of a gun, he saw the weapon in the act of falling, breathless, and a prisoner. An exclamation of surprise from the officer recalled him, in some degree, to himself. He looked round. Grip, after working in secret all the afternoon, and with redoubled vigour while everybody's attention was distracted, had plucked away the straw from Hugh's bed, and turned up the loose ground with his iron bill. The hole had been recklessly filled to the brim, and was merely sprinkled with earth. Golden cups, spoons, candlesticks, coined guineas, all the riches were revealed. They brought spades and a sack, dug up everything that was hidden there, and carried away more than 2 men could lift. They handcuffed him and bound his arms, searched him, and took away all he had. Nobody questioned or reproached him, or seemed to have much curiosity about him. The 2 men he had stunned were carried off by their companions in the same business-like way in which everything else was done. Finally, he was left under a guard of 4 soldiers with fixed bayonets, while the officer directed in person the search of the house and the other buildings connected with it. This was soon completed. The soldiers formed again in the yard. He was marched out with his guard about him, and ordered to fall in where a space was